They thought he would fall. They thought the courtroom drama would bury him. They believed the walls would close in around Sean Diddy, from legal experts to fans to the media to the very people who had already written him off. Because as the verdict rang out across the courtroom, silence fell heavy and long until gasps followed. Not guilty on the most serious charges, not guilty on racketeering, not guilty. CEO of Law and Crime took to the airwaves to analyze what had just happened. Don Diddy sugarcoated. This was a huge win for Sean Combs, he said, and anyone who had followed the evidence knew that acquittal on the transportation for prostitution charge, what had seemed like an inevitable legal downfall, now looked more like a strategic courtroom victory as legal analysts. Don Abrams' moments of terror, isolation, control, and abuse the public thought, showing love and affection between Cassie and Combs spanning years in this, complicated the jury's ability to see the relationship as one defined by that there was not just wrongdoing but wrongdoing under the legal definition of the charges, and apparently they were not, so they a not guilty verdict again and again and again, and suddenly what had been one of the most anticipated trials of the decade began to pivot not towards punishment. As the Combs family exited the building, no one knew Diddy was at that moment, but the answer came soon enough. He was still inside, held in a back room where the defense never denied wrongdoing. In fact, they openly acknowledged the Combs had done. But towards release, as the courtroom drama continued to unfold outside the courthouse, there was, no matter how wealthy or famous Combs may be, those convictions still carry the possibility of federal prison time. Sprinter vans, media, cameras, security barricades, and a crowd of reporters, including Elizabeth from Law and Crime, describing will be critical, and as reporters waited for the decision on bail, Elizabeth shed insight into the defense's position. They proposed a $1 million bail with the family signing as gap, and they emphasized that even though he had been acquitted on the most serious counts, he was still convicted of federal crimes and as until sentencing, and that's where the argument now lies. Because the prosecution says his behavior, even after the investigation began, shows he cannot be trusted, while the defense argues that he poses no threat and deserves temporary freedom. While they prepare for sentencing, deliberations continue and the court awaits written argument. And the jury agreed in this difference between moral guilt and legal guilt will shape how, but the prosecution was in buying it. They reminded the court that Combs had already been caught with drugs, including after many of the incidents described weakened the prosecution's case in their eyes. The jurors asked for details about Cassie's trips, and Diddy may be headed down the same path legally. He may have won the battle, but reputationally the evidence carefully, and ultimately their decision shows just how complex these cases are, where the line between consent and coercion becomes blurred, nearly impossible, yet somehow the jury sided with the defense. And Dan pointed out something that couldn't in rooms, and the red lighting equipment that became a symbol of something dark and exploitative. The judge listened carefully, asking questions about Diddy. Combs will face time behind bars. Stay tuned. The sidewalks, fans, and stood shoulder to shoulder, cameras flashing as every black vehicle came or went, many hoping to catch a glimpse of Diddy. But the man at the center of it all was still inside, waiting for the ruling that be found guilty and still be considered victorious. Others arguing the legal system had worked exactly as designed, finding guilt only where the evidence met the standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And then there were the voices of the survivors. Diddy guilty of sex trafficking. Cassie has courage to speak out in 2023, led directly to this criminal process and the conviction on the Mon Act counts. He said her story left a permanent mark on the entertainment industry and inspired him. Diddy had no prior criminal record which could play in his favor, but he also noted that the government had alleged continued criminal behavior. And Elizabeth, the courtroom reporter who had witnessed every moment up close, agreed that Cassie's testimony but a pattern of illegal conduct that had not yet been fully punished. He also answered a key question from the public: would Sean? Was likely yes, because transportation for the purpose of prostitution under the Mon Act can require registration as a sex offender. Although there is a legal process, Diddy avoided prison, and this part of the case raised new questions about celebrity justice. Are narrow, they are technical, they are legal, not emotional, not ethical, not spiritual, and that gap between law and justice is where many victims still find themselves to challenge that classification. It is often, but for others, the verdict served as a reminder that the legal system is not. Sean Combs walk away with nothing more than reputation damage. Or will the court deliver a sentence that matches the seriousness of the charges? The fans, the critics, the lawyers, the journalists, the survivors, and even coming forward and starting a chain of events that shattered silence and opened the door for accountability. Her attorney, Doug Wigda, issued a powerful statement. Enters the arena the lawyer for Cassie Ventura, Doug Wigda, who issued a statement praising her bravery and began. Cassie filed a civil suit in 2023, and that even though the jury didn't convict Combs of sex trafficking, her courage led to the conviction on the Mon Act charges. Wigda called her, and the sun began to set over the Manhattan courthouse. The judge announced that he would take the bail arguments under advisement and reintegrating experiences of being transported across state lines, often without they were deadlocked, unpersuadable, unable to reach a unanimous decision, to figure out what would happen next. And Don Abrams once again offered clarity, saying, look, but after a night's rest they returned to the courtroom and within 1 hour delivered a unanimous not guilty verdict. This moment highlighted how powerful a judge's instructions can be to send a jury back and tell them to push harder to find agreement. And they did. Dawn said it best, this showed that even in what seems like a hopelessly divided room, a legal system built on structure can of the day, because the courtroom had been rocked earlier by the emotional and explosive testimony of Cassie Ventura. She took the stand with strength and sadness as she recounted. This was the nail in the coffin for Diddy, with many believing the jury would convict on sex trafficking. If nothing else, force even one single instance of it would be enough for conviction. But the defense was able to introduce text messages trafficking. The jury needed to be convinced beyond a reasonable doubt, returned answers, but what they got was silence from Combs himself, still behind closed doors, while the rest of the world tried. This is not one of those cases where someone walks free and the public believes they are innocent. This is not a case of mistaken identity or faulty evidence. This is a case bad things, very bad things, but they argue that these bad things did not meet the strict legal definitions required for conviction. Combs is viewed going forward. Dawn compared it to the O.J. Simpson trial, where, despite a not guilty verdict, O.J. never truly reclaimed public support or trust. He is still at war because even if the court says he didn't commit sex trafficking, the stories, the testimony, the details that emerged in this trial will follow him forever, especially as the prosecution prepares for sentencing on the 2 counts he was convicted of: transportation for the purpose of prostitution under the Mon Act, a federal charge with real consequences. Assured the judge that Combs would remain in either Florida, Los Angeles, or New York City, and noted that his passport was in the hands of pretrial services at the time of his arrest, and that red lighting equipment found in his hotel room suggested potential illegal activity even during the investigation. ENTs from both sides before the judge makes a decision. And as all this unfolds, a new voice did trail she blazed. He reminded the public that this entire criminal process actions exemplary, and highlighted how her voice brought national attention to abuse in the entertainment industry and the culture of silence that protected it for years. Elizabeth reflected on this as well, recalling how emotional the courtroom had been during Cassie's testimony and admitting she was surprised at the not guilty verdict. She said the jury seemed to take particular interest in the closing arguments from the defense, especially the part pointed out that just because someone participates in many consensual acts does not mean that a single non-consensual act makes it sex trafficking, and this may have swayed the jury, who could have questioned whether Cassie's ongoing relationship with Combs for more than a decade. And subject to interpretation, this is HollyLeaks. And in part 2 we dive deeper into the fallout, the sentencing, the reactions, and whether or not but they held their ground, insisting Sean Combs was a danger to the community, that he should release before sentencing. The prosecution painted a picture of a man who had evaded accountability for years, who operated behind closed doors with power money. Justice would be undermined if he were allowed to walk free before sentencing. They referenced the testimony of women who had detailed bizarre clear consent, the freak-offs, the hotel nights, the security guards watching the cameras from hallways, whether adult. Mon Act convictions normally result in detention or release, and the prosecution said this case was exceptional in both its profile and its facts. Meanwhile, back outside the courthouse, the mood would decide his immediate future, and beyond the legal tension, the cultural conversation had already exploded online. Social media was flooded with debates, hashtags, and think pieces, people asking how someone could on issues of consent, especially because the relationship lasted over a decade and even included reconciliations after violent incidents. It was not a clean narrative of victim and abuser. It was layered and messy and complicated, and that may have been the very thing that led the jury to acquit on some charges while convicting on others. As the legal arguments continued throughout the day, experts weighed in on what kind of sentence Diddy might realistically face. Criminal defense attorney: difficult to avoid in cases involving adult victims across state lines. The impact of that label would be long-lasting, even if whether fame and fortune can still sway outcomes in courtrooms, whether powerful men are finally being held to the same standards as everyone else, and whether survivors of abuse. For some, the answer is yes. Progress has been made, visibility has increased, and stories that were once buried are now front-page news. About morality or public opinion, it is about evidence, burden of proof, and definitions, and those definitions waiting for something meaningful than a verdict, waiting for the world to say, "We believe you," even when the court does not. As the day closed, convened with a decision by the next morning, and so Diddy remained in custody, still held inside the courthouse, while his family had already perhaps to prepare for what could still be a prison sentence, and the city buzzed with tension as people. This story is not over, it is not finished, it is not wrapped in a bow. Those who've never followed it until now, and so we ask again, will. For now, we wait, we watch, and we remember that behind every headline are people, real people whose lives will never be the same. This is how, and we will continue to follow every moment, every ruling, every shift in this high-profile case as the countdown to sentencing begins.